The Wyoming sunset painted the vast prairie in hues of gold and crimson, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape below. Rebecca Morgan pressed her trembling hand against the cool window of the Greyhound bus, watching the endless expanse of grasslands and distant mountains roll past in a blur of amber and purple. Her reflection stared back from the glass, half her face beautiful and unblemished, while the other half bore the jagged scar that had become her unwanted companion 2 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter in her worn leather purse crinkled as the bus hit another pothole in the rural highway. She had read those careful, hopeful words so many times that she could recite them from memory. Dear Miss Morgan, I am looking for a genuine partner who understands life's hardships and values honest living in ranch country. I have a stable home, good land, and a sincere heart to offer. If you're willing to build a life together in the open country of Wyoming, I believe we could find happiness. Yours truly, Ethan Harrison. Simple words, but they had been a lifeline when everything else in Rebecca's world had crumbled to dust. The car accident in Boston had taken more than her flawless appearance. It had stolen her future, her fiancé, her place in the only world she had ever known. The elegant restaurants and exclusive social circles of Boston society had no place for a woman whose face bore the permanent reminder of tragedy. Before we dive deeper into Rebecca's journey, tell us where you're tuning in from today. And if this story resonates with you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow I've saved something truly special just for you. As the bus rounded another bend, Rebecca caught her first glimpse of Willow Creek. The settlement was barely more than a handful of weathered buildings huddled against the foothills, as if seeking shelter from the vast wilderness that surrounded it. A general store, a small diner, a modest church with a simple wooden cross, and perhaps a dozen houses scattered along what generously could be called a main street. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray ribbons, dissipating quickly in the crisp autumn air. The bus lurched to a stop outside the general store, and the driver's gruff voice called out, "Willow Creek." "End of the line, miss." Rebecca gathered her meager belongings, a small suitcase containing everything she still owned, her mother's Bible, and the carefully preserved photograph of her family taken before the accident that changed everything. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her auburn hair, making sure it fell forward to partially conceal the scarred side of her face. The driver helped her down from the bus, his eyes quickly darting away when he glimpsed her scar in the afternoon light. She had grown accustomed to that reaction, the initial shock followed by uncomfortable avoidance. It was better than the looks of pity or revulsion she sometimes encountered. "You expecting someone to meet you, miss?" the driver asked, already beginning to unload her luggage. "Yes," she replied softly, though doubt crept into her voice as she scanned the few people visible on the street. None of them seemed to be looking for anyone in particular. "Mr. Ethan Harrison." The driver nodded and tipped his hat. "Well, I'm sure he'll be along directly. Good luck to you, miss." As the bus disappeared around the bend, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake, Rebecca found herself truly alone for the first time since beginning this journey. The silence of the prairie was profound, broken only by the distant sound of wind through the tall grass and the occasional creak of wooden buildings settling in the afternoon heat. She positioned herself near her suitcase and waited, trying to ignore the curious glances from the few townspeople who passed by. An elderly woman emerged from the general store, pausing to study Rebecca with frank interest before hurrying on her way. Two men loading supplies onto a pickup truck spoke in low voices, their eyes occasionally drifting in her direction. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the street. Rebecca's stomach clenched with a familiar mixture of anxiety and hunger. She had eaten sparingly during the journey, mindful of her dwindling funds. The little money she had managed to save from her work as a receptionist after the accident was nearly gone, spent on the long journey west. An hour passed, then two. The afternoon shadows grew longer, and the prairie air carried an increasing chill. Rebecca pulled her light jacket tighter on her shoulders, fighting back the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm her. What if Ethan Harrison had changed his mind? What if he had seen her arrive and decided that even a mail-order bride wasn't worth taking on a woman with her condition? She thought of the last letter she had sent, the one where she had tried to be honest about her appearance. I must tell you that I bear a scar from a serious accident. If this changes your feelings about our arrangement, I will understand completely. His response had been brief but reassuring. We all bear scars of one kind or another. What matters is the heart beneath. But words on paper were different from reality. She had learned that bitter lesson when her fiancé James had taken one look at her bandaged face in the hospital and mumbled excuses about needing time to think. She never saw him again, though she heard through mutual friends that he had married a banker's daughter within 8 months. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Rebecca made a decision. She couldn't stand on this street corner indefinitely. With considerable effort, she managed to drag her suitcase toward the general store. The proprietor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair, looked up from his ledger as she entered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Good evening, miss. You look like you could use some assistance. I'm looking for Ethan Harrison, she said, keeping her scarred side turned away from the lamplight. I was supposed to meet him here today. The man's expression grew puzzled. Ethan Harrison? I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name around these parts. Been here 20 years, and I know most folks for 30 miles around. Rebecca's heart sank like a stone in deep water. Are you certain? He said he had a ranch near Willow Creek. Positive, miss. Could be you've got the wrong town. There's a Willow Springs about a day's ride north, and Pine Creek is 2 days south. She shook her head slowly. The letter had clearly stated Willow Creek, Wyoming. No, this is the place he mentioned. The shopkeeper's wife appeared from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. What's the trouble, Frank? Young lady here is looking for someone named Ethan Harrison. Says she was supposed to meet him. The woman's face softened with sympathy. Oh dear, I'm afraid there's been some mistake. You look worn to the bone, child. Why don't you come back to the kitchen and have some coffee while we sort this out? Rebecca wanted to refuse. Pride demanded that she handle this crisis with dignity, but exhaustion and hunger made the decision for her. She followed the woman, Mrs. Holloway, to a cozy kitchen behind the store. The warmth from the wood stove was a blessing after hours in the cool evening air. Now then, Mrs. Holloway said, bustling about to pour coffee and slice bread. Tell me about this Mr. Harrison. How did you come to meet him? Rebecca's fingers trembled as she reached for the coffee cup. The warmth seeped through the ceramic, providing comfort for both her hands and her frayed nerves. We corresponded for several months. He advertised for a wife in a Boston newspaper. I needed a fresh start. She didn't elaborate on why she needed that fresh start, but Mrs. Holloway's sharp eyes had already noticed the careful way Rebecca positioned herself to keep the scarred side of her face in shadow. Did you keep his letters? Mrs. Holloway asked gently. Rebecca nodded and retrieved the small bundle from her purse. Mrs. Holloway examined them carefully, her frown deepening with each page. Frank, she called to her husband, who appeared in the doorway. Come look at this. Something's not right about these letters. Frank took the correspondence and studied it closely. After several minutes, he shook his head grimly. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, miss, but I believe you've been the victim of a cruel deception. What do you mean? Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. The paper's good quality and the handwriting educated, but look here at the postmarks. These were all sent from Denver, not from any Wyoming town. And see how the ink varies? Like they were written at different times but all sent together. The implications hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Someone had deliberately misled her, stringing her along with false promises while she spent her meager savings on the journey west. But why? What could anyone gain from such cruelty? There are men, Mrs. Holloway said quietly, her voice filled with disgust, who take pleasure in deceiving vulnerable women, sometimes for money, sometimes just for the sport of it. Rebecca set down the coffee cup with shaking hands. The full magnitude of her situation was becoming clear. She was stranded in a remote prairie town with no money, no prospects, and no way to return to the life she had left behind. Not that there was much of a life to return to. What am I going to do? The words escaped as a broken whisper. Mrs. Holloway reached across the table and covered Rebecca's ungloved hand with her own weathered one. First, you're going to spend the night here. We have a small room above the store. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next. I can't pay you, Rebecca said, shame burning in her cheeks. I spent nearly everything on the journey. Did I ask for payment? Mrs. Holloway's voice was firm but kind. There's not a soul in this town who hasn't faced hard times. We look after our own here. That night, in the small room above the general store, Rebecca lay awake listening to the sounds of the prairie night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to echo the desolation in her own heart. She touched the scarred side of her face, feeling the familiar ridges and valleys of damaged skin. Back in Boston, she'd been someone daughter of a respected professor, engaged to a promising young attorney, welcomed in society despite her family's modest means. The accident had changed everything in a matter of seconds. The taxicab collision had left the driver dead and Rebecca hanging between life and death for weeks. She had been one of the fortunate ones, if survival with permanent disfigurement could be called fortunate. The months that followed had been a slow education in how quickly the world could turn its back on someone who no longer fit its definition of acceptable. James's abandonment had been just the beginning. Friends became distant, job prospects evaporated, and even her own family struggled to know how to treat her. Her mother still loved her, of course, but Rebecca had seen the grief. In her eyes, grief for the daughter she had been, the future that was lost. Creating and narrating this story took us considerable time and effort, so if you're enjoying it, please subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. Now, let's continue with Rebecca's journey. The advertisement for mail-order brides had seemed like providence, a chance to start over somewhere far from pitying looks and whispered conversations. A man who claimed to value character over appearance, who promised a simple life built on honest work and mutual respect. Now staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams in the darkness, Rebecca wondered if she was naive to believe such a thing was possible. Perhaps her scar marked her as permanently damaged, destined for a life of solitude and charity. The next morning brought no solutions, only the harsh clarity of daylight. Mrs. Holloway provided breakfast and gentle conversation, but the fundamental problem remained unchanged. There might be work for you here, Mrs. Holloway suggested over coffee. Mrs. Turner at the schoolhouse mentioned needing help with the younger children. It wouldn't pay much, but it would give you a roof and meals. Rebecca considered this. A life as a teacher's assistant in a remote prairie town was far from what she had imagined, but it was honest work. Perhaps in time she could save enough money to, what? Return to Boston? Start over somewhere else? I would be grateful for any work, she said finally. It was then that they heard the commotion outside, voices raised in what sounded like an argument, followed by the heavy tread of boots on the wooden walkway. Mrs. Holloway frowned and moved to the window. That's strange, she murmured. Someone's coming up from the Richardson ranch, and they look like they've been riding hard. Rebecca joined her at the window, careful to stay back from the glass. A man was tying his horse to the hitching post in front of the store. Even from a distance, she could see that he was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark blonde hair that needed cutting and clothes that spoke of long days in the open country. There was something about the way he moved, purposeful, confident, but with an underlying gentleness in how he handled his obviously tired horse, that caught her attention. "That's Noah Richardson," Mrs. Holloway said, her tone carrying a note of surprise. "He rarely comes to town unless it's absolutely necessary. Wonder what brings him in today." As if sensing their observation, the man looked up toward the window. For just a moment, his eyes seemed to meet Rebecca's across the distance, and she stepped quickly back into the shadows, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't explain. Below, Noah Richardson gathered his saddlebags and headed toward the store entrance. His weathered face was set in lines of grim determination. Whatever had brought him to Willow Creek, it was clear that his business was urgent. The heavy footsteps on the wooden stairs made Rebecca's pulse quicken. She heard Frank's greeting below, followed by a deep voice that seemed to carry the weight of the open prairie itself. The conversation was muted, but she caught fragments, something about supplies and urgent business. Mrs. Holloway noticed her tension. "Noah is a good man, dear. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's never been anything but decent to folks in town. Lost his wife some years back to fever. Been raising his son alone up on Raven Ridge ever since." The words stirred something unexpected in Rebecca's chest, a recognition of shared loss, perhaps. She found herself listening more intently to the conversation below, trying to discern the character of this rancher from the cadence of his speech. "I need to speak with whoever's handling arrangements for the Turner place," Noah's voice carried. Clearly now. "Heard in town that Mrs. Turner's looking for help at the schoolhouse." "Funny you should mention that," Frank replied. "We've got a young lady here who's in need of work." Rebecca's stomach clenched. The last thing she wanted was charity or pity from a stranger, especially one who might take one look at her and change his mind about whatever arrangement he had in mind. "I'll fetch her," Mrs. Holloway whispered, but Rebecca caught her arm. "Please," she said quietly, let me prepare myself first." Mrs. Holloway's eyes softened with understanding. She had already noticed how carefully Rebecca positioned herself, always keeping the scarred side of her face turned away from direct light. "Of course, dear. Take your time." Rebecca moved to the small mirror above the wash basin, studying her reflection with the critical eye she had developed over the past 2 years. The left side of her face remained untouched by the accident-smooth skin, a clear blue eye, lips that had once been called lovely. But the right side told a different story entirely. The scar began at her temple, spreading down across her cheek and jaw in a jagged pattern of raised, discolored tissue. The impact had been merciless, shattering the window glass and embedding fragments in her skin, creating a network of lines that no amount of healing could completely smooth. Her right eye had been spared, though the skin around it was permanently pulled tight, giving her an asymmetrical appearance that she had never grown accustomed to seeing. She remembered the first time she had looked in a mirror after the bandages came off. Her mother had been beside her, tears streaming down her face as she tried to find comforting words. "It's not so bad, Rebecca. In time, perhaps there might be treatments," but they both knew the truth. In 1953, there were no treatments for scars this severe. What remained was what she would carry for the rest of her life. The mirror in the Holloway's spare room showed her the same reality she faced. Every morning, she adjusted her hair carefully, arranging the auburn waves to fall forward on the damaged side, then positioned herself to create as much shadow as possible. It was a routine born of necessity and practice to perfection. The conversation below had moved outside, giving her time to compose herself. Through the window, she could see Noah Richardson more clearly now. He was indeed a large man, probably in his mid-30s, with the kind of solid build that came from years of physical labor. His clothes were practical worn jeans, a flannel shirt, and a jacket that had seen considerable use. There was something about his bearing that suggested competence and reliability, qualities that had become precious to Rebecca after her recent deception. As she watched, he knelt beside his horse, checking the animal's legs with gentle, practiced hands. The gesture spoke of a man who cared for his animals, who understood responsibility and stewardship. It was a small thing, but after months of correspondence with a man who turned out to be entirely fictional, Rebecca found herself noting every detail that might indicate character. She made her way downstairs carefully, each step measured and deliberate. The conversation outside had paused, and she could hear Noah talking quietly to his horse, words of reassurance and praise that made her smile despite her nervousness. Mrs. Holloway met her at the bottom of the stairs. "He seems like a decent sort," she whispered, "and he's specifically looking for someone to help at the schoolhouse. Apparently, his son is starting there next term, and he wants to make sure the school stays open. They're short-staffed since Mrs. Turner's daughter left for college." Rebecca's eyebrows rose. "I thought Mrs. Turner needed help at the schoolhouse." "She does, dear. Noah's been paying part of her salary since the county cut funding last year. His ranch is the largest operation around here, and he's been keeping half the town afloat since the railroad changed its route. Doesn't make a fuss about it, though." The implications were both encouraging and terrifying. Working at a schoolhouse meant steady employment and interaction with children, who were often more accepting than adults, but it also meant being seen by the entire community. They stepped outside together, and Rebecca got her first clear look at Noah Richardson. He was even more imposing up close, easily 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and hands that showed the calluses of hard work. His hair was dark blonde with threads of premature gray at the temples, and his eyes were the deep blue of summer skies. But it was his face that surprised her most. Despite the weathered skin and the lines etched by sun and wind, there was a gentleness there, a kind of quiet strength that spoke of deep understanding. "Mr. Richardson," Mrs. Holloway said, "I'd like you to meet Miss Rebecca Morgan. She's recently arrived from Boston and is looking for employment." Noah removed his hat, revealing more of that unruly blonde hair. His eyes met Rebecca's directly, and she saw them take in her appearance, the careful arrangement of her hair, the shadow she tried to create, and yes, the visible portion of her scar. But unlike every other first meeting she'd experienced in the past 2 years, his expression didn't change. No shock, no awkward avoidance, no barely concealed pity. "Miss Morgan," he said simply, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised her. "Mrs. Holloway tells me you're in need of work." "Yes, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I have experience with children. I was studying to become a teacher before." She trailed off, unsure how to reference the accident that had derailed her plans. He nodded thoughtfully. "The position I'm inquiring about is at the schoolhouse. Mrs. Turner needs an assistant teacher for the younger children reading, basic arithmetic, that sort of thing. The school's small, about 20 children from ages 6 to 12, from the town and surrounding ranches." Rebecca felt a spark of genuine interest. Teaching had been her dream before the accident, before she'd convinced herself that no parent would want their child learning from someone who looked like her. "That sounds like something I would be well suited for, Mr. Richardson." Noah studied her for another moment, his expression thoughtful. The pay would be modest: room at the schoolhouse, meals, and $15 a week. But it's honest work, and those children need someone who cares about their education. $15 a week was more than she had dared hope for, especially with room and board included. But there were practical considerations that couldn't be ignored. "Mr. Richardson," she said carefully, "I feel I should be honest about my circumstances. I was deceived by someone claiming to offer marriage, and I find myself stranded here with very limited resources. If you're looking for someone with impeccable credentials or references, I may not be suitable." Noah was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those thoughtful blue eyes. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Miss Morgan, I'm not interested in your past circumstances or anyone else's opinion of your character. What matters to me is whether you can teach children their letters and numbers, and whether you have the patience to deal with 20 youngsters who'd rather be outside chasing jackrabbits than sitting at a desk. Everything else is your own business." The simple acceptance in his words nearly undid her composure. It had been so long since someone had spoken to her without judgment or pity that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. "I would be very grateful for the opportunity," she sighed quietly. "There is one more thing," Noah continued, his expression growing more serious. "Life out here can be harsh. The winters are long, the work is hard, and we're 30 miles from the nearest doctor. You'd need to be prepared for that reality." Rebecca thought of the accident, of the terror of being trapped in the crushed taxi, of the weeks of surgeries and painful recovery. Physical hardship seemed almost trivial compared to the emotional devastation she had already survived. "I understand," she said simply. Noah studied her for another moment, then nodded. "We'll leave tomorrow morning, if that suits you. I need to finish gathering supplies today." "That would be perfect." As Noah headed into the general store to complete his business, Mrs. Holloway squeezed Rebecca's arm. "I think you've made a good choice, dear. Noah Richardson is known for his integrity. If he says he'll treat you fairly, he will." That evening, as Rebecca packed her few belongings, she found herself thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. 2 days ago, she had been en route to meet a husband who turned out to be a fiction. Now she was preparing to travel to a schoolhouse with a man she had known for less than an hour, to take on work she had once dreamed of doing. But there had been something in Noah Richardson's manner that inspired confidence. He had looked at her scar without flinching, spoken to her without condescension, and offered her honest work without demands for explanations she wasn't ready to give. It was more respect than she had received from anyone in months. As she folded her mother's handkerchief, one of the few personal items she had brought west, Rebecca allowed herself a moment of grief for the life she had left behind. Boston had been her world for 25 years. She had known every street, every park, every social convention. The accident had destroyed more than just her appearance. It had shattered the illusion of safety and predictability that had defined her existence. The scarring was only the visible part of what the accident had taken from her. The invisible wounds ran deeper, the loss of confidence, the shattering of her faith in the future, the slow erosion of her sense of self-worth as one door after another closed in her face. James's rejection had been the final blow, convincing her that she would never again be worthy of love or even basic human companionship. The mail-order bride advertisement had seemed like a chance to reinvent herself, somewhere far from the pitying looks and whispered conversations. Even if love was impossible, perhaps she could find acceptance, a partnership built on mutual need, rather than romantic feeling. The correspondence with Ethan Harrison had fed that hope, creating an elaborate fantasy of a simple life in Wyoming, with a man who claimed to value character over beauty. Now, sitting in a spare room above a general store in a town she had never heard of a week ago, Rebecca wondered if she was making another mistake. Was she being naive to trust Noah Richardson? Was she exchanging one form of vulnerability for another? But as she considered her alternatives, returning to Boston with her tail between her legs, staying in Willow Creek as an object of charity, or venturing into the unknown with a stranger who had offered her honest work and fair treatment, the choice seemed clear. At least at the schoolhouse, her failures would be her own, and her successes, however small, would belong to her as well. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that seemed possible only in the wide open spaces of Wyoming. Noah arrived at the general store just after sunrise, leading a sturdy mare alongside his own mount. "She's gentle but sure-footed," he said, indicating the mare. "Her name's Willow. My son Matthew learned to ride on her." Rebecca approached the horse carefully. She had ridden occasionally as a child. Her father had believed it was an important skill for a young lady, but it had been years since she had been in a saddle. "Hello, Willow," she murmured, offering her hand for the mare to sniff. The horse's warm breath on her palm was oddly comforting. "She likes you," Noah observed. "That's a good sign." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Holloway pressed a package of food into Rebecca's hands. "For the journey," she said firmly, brushing away Rebecca's protests. "And you write to me, do you hear? Let me know how you're getting on." The kindness of this stranger who owed her nothing brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "We look after our own," Mrs. Holloway repeated, echoing her words from the previous day. "And you're one of ours now, whether you know it or not." As they rode out of Willow Creek, Rebecca looked back only once. The little prairie town was already beginning to feel like home in a way that Boston never had again after the accident. There was something about the honesty of the place, the straightforward way people dealt with each other, that appealed to her wounded spirit. The trail Noah led her on wound through vast stretches of prairie grass that rippled like a golden sea in the morning breeze. Scattered groves of cottonwood trees provided occasional shade, their leaves rustling with a sound like gentle rain. The higher ground offered sweeping views of the landscape, rolling hills, distant mountains, and endless sky. The further they rode, the more the weight of her past seemed to lift from Rebecca's shoulders. Each mile took her further from the woman she had been and closer to whoever she might become in this new place. "Tell me about the school," she said. During a rest stop, more to break the comfortable silence than from any pressing need to know. Noah handed her a canteen of cool water. "It's been there since '32. Mabel Turner's been teaching since the beginning. Started with just 6 children, but as more families settled in the area, it grew. She's a good teacher, firm but fair. The children respect her. And your son Matthew, is it? How old is he?" Noah's expression softened at the mention of his son. 8, smart as a whip but shy around strangers. His mother taught him his letters before she passed. He reads better than most kids twice his age. "I'm sorry about your wife," Rebecca said softly. "Thank you." His voice carried a note of finality that suggested the subject was closed, but after a moment, he continued. "It was 5 years ago. Scarlet fever hit the whole county hard that winter." The simple statement revealed more than perhaps he intended. Rebecca recognized the tone, the voice of someone who had left more behind than they cared to discuss. It occurred to her that she wasn't the only one seeking refuge in the open country, and the thought was oddly comforting. As they continued their journey, Rebecca found herself studying her companion. Noah moved through the landscape with the confidence of someone completely at home in the natural world, reading signs that were invisible to her, a distant hawk circling, the pattern of clouds gathering on the horizon, tracks in the soft earth of the trail. His horse responded to the slightest touch, suggesting a partnership built on mutual trust and understanding. "Have you always lived in Wyoming?" she asked. "Not always." His tone was measured, thoughtful. "I came out here after the war. Seemed like a good place to start over." The sun was approaching its zenith when they crested a ridge, and Noah called a halt. "There it is," he said simply. Rebecca followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. The schoolhouse stood in a small valley, a white clapboard building with a bell tower and a red roof that stood out against the surrounding landscape. Behind it was a modest house, presumably Mrs. Turner's residence, and now to be partially Rebecca's. A small barn and corral completed the property. A stream meandered nearby, its water so clear she could see the stones on the bottom, even from this distance. Beyond it all, the open prairie stretched toward distant mountains, their peaks still touched with snow even in early autumn. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and meant it completely. Noah smiled for the first time since she had met him, and the expression transformed his entire face, softening the weathered lines and lighting his blue eyes with unexpected warmth. "I thought you might appreciate it. Not everyone sees the beauty in places like this." As they descended toward the schoolhouse, Rebecca felt something shift inside her, a stirring of possibility she hadn't experienced since before the accident. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges awaited in this remote prairie valley, she would face them as herself, without pretense or apology. For the first time in 2 years that felt like enough, Mrs. Turner proved to be a formidable ally from the start. A tall, angular woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, she welcomed Rebecca with brisk efficiency that left no room for awkwardness or pity. "So you've had teacher training?" she asked, leading Rebecca on a tour of the schoolhouse while Noah unloaded her belongings. 2 years at Radcliffe College, specializing in primary education. Mrs. Turner's eyebrows rose. "Radcliffe? Well, that's certainly more formal education than anyone around here has had." "What brings you to Wyoming?" The direct question might have flustered Rebecca once, but after everything she had endured, simple honesty seemed easiest. "A fresh start. My circumstances in Boston became difficult after an accident." Mrs. Turner's sharp eyes had already noted the scar, but she made no comment about it. Instead, she nodded once, as if Rebecca had passed some unspoken test. Fresh starts are what the West was built on. "Can you begin tomorrow? The children have been without proper instruction in reading and arithmetic while I've been handling everything alone." "Of course." "Good. I'll introduce you to the students in the morning. Your room is through here, simple but comfortable. Meals we'll take together. I'm not much of a cook, I'm afraid." "I can help with that," Rebecca offered. "Cooking was one of the few things I still enjoyed, even after." Mrs. Turner's expression softened slightly. "After your accident, you can say it, Miss Morgan. We don't tiptoe around difficult subjects out here. Life's too short and too hard for that kind of delicacy." The forthright acceptance in the older woman's manner was like a breath of fresh air. For 2 years, Rebecca had lived in a world of careful euphemisms and averted eyes. Mrs. Turner's matter-of-fact approach was both startling and refreshing. After the tour, Rebecca found Noah waiting by the corral, his expression unreadable as he watched her approach. "Mrs. Turner seems pleased with your qualifications," he said. "She's very direct." He smiled slightly. "That she is. Been that way as long as I've known her. Taught half the county to read and write, including most of the adults. Doesn't tolerate foolishness, but there's not a child she hasn't managed to reach somehow." "Thank you," Rebecca said suddenly, surprising herself with the intensity of her gratitude. "For bringing me here, for this opportunity." Noah studied her for a moment, his blue eyes serious. "No need for thanks, Miss Morgan. The school needs a teacher. You need work. Seems like a fair arrangement for everyone." He put on his hat, preparing to leave. "I'll bring Matthew by in the morning. School starts at 8 sharp. Mrs. Turner doesn't tolerate tardiness, even from me." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Rebecca to wonder about the complexities beneath his calm exterior. The first week at the schoolhouse unfolded in a rhythm of challenging work and unexpected moments of joy. The children, ranging from 6-year-old Sally Jenkins with her missing front teeth to 12-year-old Thomas Wilson with his serious demeanor, approached Rebecca with the unfiltered curiosity of youth. "What happened to your face, Miss Morgan?" little Billy Peterson asked on the first morning, his eyes wide with innocent wonder. Before Rebecca could formulate a response, Mrs. Turner intervened smoothly. "Miss Morgan was in an accident, Billy. It left a mark, just like the time you fell out of the hayloft and broke your arm. Remember how it healed but left that scar by your elbow? It's the same idea, just more visible. Now, who can tell me what 7 times 8 equals? The simple explanation, delivered without drama or excessive sympathy, set the tone for how her appearance would be addressed. By lunchtime, the children had accepted her scar as simply another fact about their new teacher, no more remarkable than her auburn hair or her Eastern accent. Matthew Richardson proved to be exactly as his father had described, intelligent, but reserved, with Noah's blonde hair and serious blue eyes. He watched Rebecca carefully from his seat in the second row, his expression thoughtful as she conducted her first reading lesson. "You read different than Mrs. Turner," he observed, quietly when she worked with his group. "You make the stories sound real." It was the first voluntary comment he had made, and Rebecca treasured it as a small victory. "That's because stories are real in their own way," she told him. "They take us to places we might never see otherwise." The boy considered this then, nodded solemnly. "My pa says the same thing about books. He reads to me every night." The image of the tall, weathered rancher reading bedtime stories to his son added another dimension to Rebecca's evolving understanding of Noah Richardson. The man contained depths that weren't immediately apparent. As the days passed, Rebecca found herself settling into the routine of country school life. She rose early, helped Mrs. Turner prepare the schoolhouse, taught reading and arithmetic to the younger children in the morning, then basic science and history in the afternoon. After school, she assisted with chores around the property, prepared lessons for the next day, and in the evenings, often sat with Mrs. Turner on the porch, listening to stories of the area's history. The physical demands of this new life were considerable, carrying water from the well, chopping kindling for the stoves, walking the half-mile to check on an ailing student, but Rebecca found that the activity strengthened both her body and her spirit. The persistent headaches that had plagued her since the accident began to diminish, and she slept more soundly than she had in years. More significantly, she discovered that the children's simple acceptance gradually changed how she saw herself. In their eyes, she wasn't defined by her scar, but by her patience with their struggles, her enthusiasm for their successes, and her willingness to explain concepts in different ways until understanding dawned. It was Billy Peterson who delivered perhaps the most profound insight in the artless way of 8-year-olds. After successfully reading a difficult passage that had frustrated him for days, he looked up at Rebecca with a gap-toothed grin. "You know what, Miss Morgan? When you smile, I can hardly see your scar at all." The comment, delivered without guile or calculation, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She had spent 2 years believing that nothing could overcome the visual impact of her injury, that it would always be the first and only thing people saw when they looked at her. But here was evidence that genuine connection could transcend physical appearance. Noah Richardson visited the school regularly, sometimes bringing supplies from town, other times simply checking on his son's progress. Rebecca noticed that he always stayed to observe at least part of a lesson, his expression thoughtful as he watched her work with the children. One crisp October afternoon, nearly a month after her arrival, she found him waiting outside after the students had been dismissed. He stood by the hitching post, watching as Matthew played with several other boys near the stream. "Mr. Richardson," she acknowledged, suddenly conscious of her windblown hair and the chalk dust on her dress. "Is everything all right?" "Fine, Miss Morgan. Matthew seems to be thriving under your instruction. He's talking about books at home now, asking for more stories." Pride warmed her chest. He has a natural curiosity. All children do, but his seems especially keen. Noah nodded, his eyes still on his son. His mother was the same way, always asking questions, wanting to understand how things worked. He turned to face her, his expression unusually open. "I wanted to thank you, not just for teaching him his letters and numbers, but for making him feel comfortable in school. He's never taken to education this way before." "That's very kind of you to say. It's the truth." He hesitated, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Miss Morgan, the fall harvest celebration is happening in town next Saturday. It's a tradition, food, music, community gathering. Matthew and I would be honored if you and Mrs. Turner would consider attending as our guests." The invitation caught Rebecca by surprise. She had ventured into town only once since her arrival, and that had been a brief, purposeful visit to mail a letter to her mother. The thought of a public celebration, with dozens of eyes potentially focused on her appearance, sent a flutter of anxiety through her stomach. Noah seemed to sense her hesitation. "You'd be welcome," he said simply. "The whole community has heard about the positive changes at the school. People would like to meet you." Before she could formulate a response, Mrs. Turner called from the schoolhouse door. "Rebecca, we need to prepare for tomorrow's science lesson." "I should go," she said, grateful for the interruption. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Richardson. I'll discuss it with Mrs. Turner." He nodded, accepting her non-answer with characteristic patience. "Of course. Good day, Miss Morgan." That evening, as they prepared vegetables for soup, Rebecca mentioned the invitation to Mrs. Turner. To her surprise, the older woman was enthusiastic. "The harvest celebration is the social event of the season," she explained, deftly peeling potatoes. "Everyone within 30 miles attends. There's dancing, food from every household, contests for the children. We should absolutely go." "I'm not sure if I'm ready for that kind of public gathering," Rebecca admitted. "My appearance," Mrs. Turner set down her knife with uncharacteristic force. "Rebecca Morgan, I have watched you these past weeks transform from a wounded soul into a confident teacher. Those children don't care about your scar, and neither does anyone with any sense. The only person still dwelling on it is you." The blunt assessment struck home with painful accuracy. "It's not that simple," Rebecca protested. "You haven't seen how people react when they first see me. The shock, the pity, the discomfort." "Perhaps not," Mrs. Turner conceded, her voice softening slightly. "But I've seen something you haven't: how the parents of your students talk about you. They don't mention your face, Rebecca. They talk about how Tommy Wilson is finally interested in reading, how Sally Jenkins can't stop practicing her numbers, how Matthew Richardson smiles more than they've ever seen. That's what matters." Here, the conversation left Rebecca thoughtful. Was it possible that she had been clinging to her injury as a kind of shield, a reason to avoid fully engaging with life again? The thought was uncomfortable, but impossible to dismiss entirely. That night, she stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, forcing herself to really look at her reflection, not just the scarred side she usually avoided, but her entire face. The scar was still there, of course, a jagged line of raised tissue that would never fully fade. But she could also see the changes of the past month, the healthy color in her cheeks from days spent partially outdoors, the light in her eyes that had been absent for 2 years, the stronger set of her jaw that spoke of renewed purpose. Perhaps Mrs. Turner was right. Perhaps it was time to stop defining herself by what she had lost and start acknowledging what she had found. The day of the harvest celebration dawned clear and cool, with the first hint of frost sparkling on the grass outside the schoolhouse. Rebecca dressed with special care in her best navy blue dress, arranging her hair in a style that acknowledged rather than attempted to hide her scar. It was a small act of courage, but it felt significant. Mrs. Turner nodded approvingly when she emerged. "There's the teacher my students admire, ready to face the community with the same confidence you show in the classroom." "As ready as I'll ever be," Rebecca replied, managing a smile despite the butterflies in her stomach. Noah and Matthew arrived to escort them to town in a polished wagon that clearly wasn't used for everyday ranch work. Noah himself looked different. His usual work clothes replaced by clean dark trousers, a white shirt, and a vest. He had trimmed his hair and beard, the effect making him appear younger and highlighting the strong lines of his face. "Miss Morgan," he said, his eyes warming with approval as he helped her into the wagon. "You look lovely today." The simple compliment, delivered with obvious sincerity, brought color to her cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Richardson. You and Matthew look quite distinguished yourselves." The boy beamed at being included in the compliment, his usual reserve melting as he eagerly pointed out landmarks along the way to town. "That's where we saw the wolf pack last winter, and over there is where Pa taught me to shoot, and beyond that hill is where the wild horses sometimes come." Willow Creek had been transformed for the celebration. Colorful bunting hung between buildings, tables laden with food lined the main street, and a wooden platform had been erected at one end for musicians. It seemed the entire county had turned out families Rebecca recognized from school, ranchers from outlying properties, merchants, and travelers passing through. As their wagon approached, Rebecca felt her anxiety rising. This would be her first real introduction to the larger community, the first time many of them would see her scar. Instinctively, she started to turn her head to present her unmarked profile. Noah's voice, pitched low so only she could hear, stopped her. "You have nothing to hide, Miss Morgan." "Not here, not from these people." The quiet confidence in his tone gave her courage. She faced forward as they entered the town, her head held high despite the rapid beating of her heart. The initial moments were exactly as she had feared, conversations pausing, eyes turning in their direction, the inevitable flicker of surprise as people noticed her scar. But what came next was entirely unexpected. Instead of awkward avoidance, there were smiles of welcome. Instead of whispered comments, there were direct approaches and introductions. "So you're the new teacher my Henry can't stop talking about. The stories you read, Miss Morgan. Sally's finally understanding her numbers thanks to you. Matthew says you're making a proper library at the school. My wife has some books she'd be happy to donate." Each greeting, each expression of appreciation for her work, chipped away at the protective shell she had built around herself. These people weren't seeing her as a curiosity or an object of pity. They were seeing her as a valued member of their community, someone who was making a difference in their children's lives. The day unfolded in a blur of introductions, conversations, and simple pleasures. Rebecca found herself drawn into the celebration, sampling dishes from every household, clapping along with the fiddle music, watching the children's sack races with genuine delight. Noah remained nearby, a steady presence that somehow both grounded her and made her acutely aware of his every movement. As afternoon shifted to evening, lanterns were lit around the town square, and the musicians struck up a lively tune. Couples began to gather for dancing young sweethearts, long-married farmers and their wives, even children mimicking the adults' movements. Rebecca watched from the sidelines, content to observe this tradition that was so different from the formal dances of her Boston past. She was startled when Noah appeared beside her, extending his hand. "Would you honor me with a dance, Miss Morgan?" She stared at his outstretched hand, then up at his face, searching for any sign of pity or obligation. What she found instead was simple invitation, and something warmer that made her pulse quicken. "I'm afraid I don't know these dances," she admitted. His smile was reassuring, nothing complicated about them. "Just following the music and your partner." Taking a deep breath, Rebecca placed her hand in his. "Then I would be delighted, Mr. Richardson." As he led her to the area cleared for dancing, she was acutely aware of eyes turning in their direction. Noah Richardson was clearly respected in this community, and his choice of dance partner would not go unnoticed. But when he turned to face her, placing one hand lightly at her waist and holding her scarred right hand in his left, all other considerations faded. The dance was indeed simple, a pattern of steps and turns that followed the fiddle's cheerful melody. Noah guided her with the same quiet confidence he showed in everything, his touch respectful but secure. Rebecca found herself relaxing into the movement, following his lead, and for brief moments, actually forgetting to be self-conscious about her appearance. "You're a natural," he commented as they circled the floor. "I had dancing lessons as a girl, but this is nothing like the formal waltzes we practiced. Do you miss it? That life in Boston?" The question was unexpected, forcing her to consider what she had left behind versus what she had found. "Some aspects," she admitted. "The libraries, the concerts, certain friends. But there was so much artifice, so much emphasis on appearance and status. After my accident, I realized how shallow much of it was." Noah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The West has its own hardships, but at least here, people tend to judge you by what you can do, not where you came from or what you look like." As the music ended, he didn't immediately release her hand. Instead, he looked down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Rebecca, Miss Morgan, whatever he had been about to say was interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the gathering. A group of riders had entered the town, their horses lathered from hard riding, their manner aggressive as they dismounted and headed for the nearest tables of food and drink. Noah's expression changed instantly, his jaw tightening as he scanned the newcomers. "Trouble," he said quietly, releasing Rebecca's hand. "Stay here with Mrs. Turner." Before she could respond, he was moving through the crowd toward the disturbance, his posture alert but controlled. Matthew appeared beside her, his young face concerned. "Who are they?" Rebecca asked, watching as the strangers helped themselves to food and drink without invitation. "Hands from the Blackwater Ranch," Matthew explained, his voice tense. "They don't get along with Pa. Their boss, Mr. Hargrove, tried to buy our land last year when things were hard. Pa refused." Rebecca watched as Noah approached the leader of the group, a tall, lean man with a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruel set of his mouth. Their conversation was too distant to overhear, but the body language was clear, Noah's controlled but firm, the other man's increasingly belligerent. The confrontation seemed to be diffusing when one of the other riders said something that made the crowd around them go silent. Noah's response was immediate, a step forward, his hands clenched at his sides. Only the intervention of Frank Holloway and several other townsmen prevented the situation from escalating further. The Blackwater men eventually moved off, taking bottles of whiskey with them but leaving the celebration subdued in their wake. Noah returned to Rebecca's side, his expression carefully neutral, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. "I apologize for the interruption," he said formally. "Those men have no respect for community gatherings. Matthew told me there's been conflict between your ranches." Noah glanced at his son, then back to Rebecca. "Curtis Hargrove has been trying to expand his holdings. My land sits between his ranch and the river valuable for water rights. We've had disagreements." The careful understatement suggested deeper issues than mere property disputes, but Rebecca didn't press. The warm connection they had shared during the dance seemed temporarily suspended, replaced by a careful politeness that felt like a step backward. As they prepared to return to the schoolhouse later that evening, however, Noah drew her aside for a moment. "I wanted to say today, seeing you with the community, watching how they've already accepted you as their children's teacher, it was remarkable, but not surprising." "What do you mean?" His blue eyes held hers steadily. "I mean that when people see beyond the surface, they discover what truly matters. You've given these children something invaluable, a teacher who believes in them. That's what this community sees when they look at you, Rebecca. Not your scar, but your heart." The words, spoken with such quiet conviction, touched something deep within her, a place that had been wounded not just by the physical accident, but by all that followed: James's abandonment, society's rejection, her own loss of faith in human connection. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to articulate the fuller response rising in her heart. Noah nodded once, understanding in his eyes, then helped her into the wagon for the journey back to the schoolhouse. As they rode beneath the star-filled Wyoming sky, Rebecca felt a fragile hope taking root, not just for her professional future, but for the possibility that her heart, like her face, might bear scars yet still be capable of giving and receiving. Love, the aftermath of the harvest celebration, brought unexpected changes to the rhythm of life at the schoolhouse. Rebecca found herself at the center of a community that had not merely accepted her presence, but embraced her contributions. Parents began stopping by with small gift jars of preserves, hand-knitted scarves for the approaching winter, books for the growing school library. Children who had once been reluctant learners now arrived early, eager to show her their progress or help prepare the classroom for the day's lessons. "You've made quite an impression," Mrs. Turner observed one evening as they sorted through a box of donated books. "I haven't seen the community this invested in education since we first built this schoolhouse 20 years ago." Rebecca smiled, running her fingers over a worn copy of Treasure Island that would delight the older boys. "They're invested in their children. I'm just fortunate enough to be the one helping them learn." "It's more than that," Mrs. Turner insisted, her usually stern expression softening. "You've brought something fresh to this place: enthusiasm, new ideas, genuine care for each child's particular needs. Old Benjamin Wilson told me yesterday that his grandson Thomas finally understands fractions after 3 years of struggling." The praise warmed Rebecca's heart, but it was the changing relationship with her students that truly transformed her sense of purpose. Each small breakthrough, Sally Jenkins writing her name without reversing letters, shy Daniel Peterson volunteering to read aloud, Matthew Richardson explaining a complex concept to younger children, reinforced her conviction that she had found her true calling. More surprising was the gradual shift in how she perceived herself. The daily routine of teaching left little time for self-consciousness about her appearance. Standing before a classroom of children who looked to her for guidance, her scar became increasingly irrelevant compared to the knowledge she could share and the encouragement she could offer. November brought the first heavy snows and a new set of challenges. The schoolhouse, though solidly built, required constant tending to remain warm enough for lessons. Rebecca rose before dawn each morning to help Mrs. Turner stoke the stoves, learned to spot and seal drafty windows, and mastered the art of banking coals to maintain heat overnight. The children arrived bundled in layers of homespun wool and hand-me-down coats, their cheeks red from the cold, boots crusted with snow that melted into puddles by the stoves. Some traveled considerable distances. The Wilson children rode 5 miles each way. The Peterson twins came by sled when the snow was too deep for horses. "We need to make the most of their journey," Rebecca told Mrs. Turner as they adjusted the curriculum. "If they're braving these conditions to reach us, we owe them the best education we can provide." Together, they developed new approaches: practical mathematics that helped students calculate feed for livestock or supplies for winter, reading lessons built around adventure stories that captured restless imaginations, history that connected to the pioneering spirit that had brought their families west. Noah Richardson's visits to the school became more frequent as winter deepened. He often arrived with practical supplies, extra firewood, repairs for the barn roof, fresh meat when hunting was good. While Matthew played with friends after lessons, Noah would linger, sometimes helping with school maintenance, other times simply conversing with Rebecca as she prepared for the next day's teaching. Their discussions ranged widely. Books they had both read, the challenges of raising a child alone, the history of the territory, the differences between Eastern and Western perspectives. In these conversations, Rebecca discovered a man whose quiet exterior concealed a thoughtful mind and surprising sensitivity. "Did you always want to be a rancher?" she asked one afternoon as they replaced a broken window pane, working together. With the easy coordination that had developed between them, Noah considered the question while carefully applying putty to secure the glass. "No. Before the war, I studied engineering at a college in Pennsylvania. Had plans to build bridges, railroads, that sort of thing." The revelation surprised her. What changed? Everything. His voice held no bitterness. just a matter-of-fact acknowledgement of how life's currents could alter one's course. The war showed me I needed space, open country, work that kept me connected to something real. When I came west after being discharged, I hired on at a ranch near Cheyenne, learned the business from the ground up, eventually saved enough to buy my own place. And then you met your wife? Rebecca ventured, curious about the woman who had been part of his life before. Noah nodded, his expression softening with memory. Clara was the doctor's daughter. Educated, cultured, everyone wondered what she saw in a rough rancher like me. She used to say she loved my hands. He glanced down at his work-roughened fingers with a small smile. Said they were honest hands that built things and cared for living creatures. The intimate glimpse into his past created a new dimension to Rebecca's understanding of the man beside her. She could picture the younger Noah, newly returned from war, finding healing in the rhythms of ranch life and unexpected love with a doctor's daughter. She sounds remarkable. She was. He finished with the window and turned to face Rebecca fully. Clara would have liked you. She believed education was the most powerful gift we could give the next generation. The conversation might have continued, but Mrs. Turner called from the schoolhouse door, a telegram in her hand. Noah, message from town. There's trouble at your south pasture. Something about Hargrove's men and your cattle. The transformation was immediate. The contemplative man beside her shifted into the alert, decisive rancher, his expression hardening. With concern, I have to go. Matthew can stay with you until I return? Of course, Rebecca assured him. He'll be safe with us. Noah thanked her with a quick nod, already moving toward his horse. I'll send word when I can. As she watched him ride away, Rebecca felt a knot of worry form in her stomach. The tension between the Richardson and Blackwater ranches had been a persistent undercurrent in local conversations, but this was the first direct confrontation since the harvest celebration. That night, as snow fell heavily outside, Rebecca sat with Matthew at the kitchen table, helping him with an essay about explorers while attempting to mask her concern about his father. Pa can handle Mr. Hargrove, the boy said suddenly, looking up from his work with eyes too perceptive for his 8 years. He always does. I'm sure he can, Rebecca agreed, surprised by the child's insight into her thoughts. Matthew returned to his writing for a moment, then added quietly, but he gets lonely fighting by himself all the time. The simple observation, delivered with a child's directness, struck Rebecca to the core. How well this young boy understood the burden his father carried, not just the practical responsibilities of the ranch, but the emotional isolation of facing every challenge alone since his wife's death. News arrived the following morning via Frank Holloway, who drove through the snow to deliver supplies and information. Hargrove's men had deliberately cut a section of fence, allowing Richardson cattle to wander onto Blackwater land, where they were being held for trespassing fees. Noah's trying to resolve it legally, Frank explained, warming his hands by the schoolhouse stove. Sheriff's involved now, but Hargrove has political connections in the county seat. It's a mess, and with this weather. He gestured toward the heavily falling snow outside. Will the cattle survive in these conditions? Rebecca asked, thinking of the animals trapped away from their normal shelter. Frank's expression was grim. That's the real concern. Hargrove's keeping them in an exposed pasture. If this storm gets worse, as it's predicted to, there could be significant losses. The implications were clear. For a ranch the size of Noah's, losing a substantial number of cattle could be financially devastating, especially in winter when replacement was impossible. That afternoon, Rebecca made a decision that surprised even herself. After dismissing the handful of students who had braved the storm to attend school, she approached Mrs. Turner with a proposal. I want to visit the Richardson ranch, she said firmly. Matthew hasn't heard from his father in 2 days. He's worried, though he's trying not to show it. And if Noah is dealing with this crisis alone, Perhaps there's something we can do to help. Mrs. Turner studied her with shrewd eyes. The storm's getting worse by the hour. The journey would be dangerous. Frank Holloway is returning to town. He could take us part way, and Noah's ranch is only 3 miles beyond Willow Creek. The older woman's expression shifted from concern to something like approval. You care for them both quite deeply, don't you, Noah and his boy? The direct question caught Rebecca off guard. Her relationship with the Richardsons had evolved so gradually that she hadn't fully acknowledged to herself the depth of her feelings. Yet faced with Mrs. Turner's perception, she couldn't deny the truth. Yes, she admitted quietly. I do. Then we'd better pack warm clothes and extra food, Mrs. Turner said practically. If we're going to a ranch in crisis, we should arrive prepared to be useful. The journey to Willow Creek was slow and difficult, the wagon struggling through snowdrifts that had already accumulated to alarming depths. Frank Holloway, initially reluctant to take the women into such conditions, drove with grim concentration, following the barely visible track that served as a road. Noah's place is northwest of town, he told them as they reached Willow Creek, now eerily silent under its blanket of snow. Normally I'd say it's an easy ride, but in this, he shook his head doubtfully. Maybe you should wait out the storm here. Is there anyone in town who could guide us? Rebecca asked, unwilling to abandon her purpose when they had come this far. Mrs. Holloway, who had emerged from the store at their arrival, provided an unexpected solution. Take Jenkins' boy. He works at Richardson's ranch in the summers, knows the way blindfolded, and he's the best tracker in the county. Young Will Jenkins, barely 17 but tall and capable, agreed to escort them. With fresh horses from the livery and sleds instead of wagons, they set out into the worsening storm, following a route that seemed indistinguishable from the surrounding white landscape to Rebecca's untrained eyes. The Richardson ranch emerged from the swirling snow like a vision, a substantial log house with a wide porch, several outbuildings, and corrals now empty of cattle. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that someone was home despite the crisis unfolding elsewhere on the property. Will led them to the main house where they were met by an elderly man who introduced himself as Hank, the ranch cook and caretaker. Mr. Richardson's been gone since yesterday morning, he explained, ushering them into the warm kitchen. Took 3 hands and headed for the south boundary where Hargrove's holding our cattle. This storm's got everyone worried sick. Matthew's at the school? He asked, concern evident in his weathered face. Safe and sound with my assistant, Mrs. Turner assured him. We came to see if we could help and to bring news to Noah about his son. While Mrs. Turner continued conversing with Hank, Rebecca took in her surroundings. The Richardson home was surprisingly comfortable, solid furniture built for durability, but not lacking in beauty. Shelves lined with books, a piano in one corner of the main room, children's drawings carefully displayed. On walls, it spoke of a man who valued more than mere survival, who had created a true home despite personal loss. There's riders coming. Will called from his position by the window, his young voice tense with excitement or concern. They all moved to look outside, where shadowy figures on horseback were emerging from the curtain of falling snow. Even at a distance, Rebecca could recognize Noah's tall form in the lead, his shoulders set in a posture of exhaustion or defeat. Hank hurried to open the door as the men dismounted, their movements slow and stiff from cold. Noah entered first, snow crusting his hat and coat, his face haggard with fatigue. He stopped abruptly at the sight of the unexpected visitors, his expression shifting from surprise to confusion. Rebecca? Mrs. Turner? What on earth are you doing here in this storm? Before she could respond, one of the ranch hands behind him spoke urgently. Boss, we need to decide about those cattle. Storm's getting worse by the minute. Noah's attention immediately returned to the crisis at hand. Get warmed up first. We'll talk strategy in 5 minutes. He turned back to Rebecca, his exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "I'm sorry, there's a situation." "We know," she said quickly. "Frank Holloway explained about Hargrove and your cattle. We came to help and to let you know that Matthew is safe." Relief flickered across his features at the mention of his son. "Thank you for that. But this isn't something you can assist with. Hargrove's men are armed and looking for confrontation. I need to focus on getting my cattle back before they freeze to death." Mrs. Turner stepped forward, her practical nature asserting itself. "Perhaps we can't help with the cattle directly, but we can ensure you and your men are properly fed and your injuries tended before you go back out there." Noah looked like he might argue, but Hank intervened. "She's right, boss. You've been riding for nearly 20 hours straight. Take 30 minutes to eat something hot and make a proper plan." Reluctantly, Noah agreed. As the men gathered around the large kitchen table, the situation became clearer. Hargrove's men had moved nearly 60 head of Richardson cattle onto Blackwater land and were refusing to release them without payment. The sheriff, caught between powerful interests, was hesitating to intervene decisively. Meanwhile, the cattle were being kept in an exposed area with minimal shelter and feed. "We could pay the fee," one of the hands suggested, only to be met with Noah's firm headshake. "That's exactly what Hargrove wants, to establish a precedent that he can charge fees whenever he creates a situation like this. Next time it would be more cattle and higher demands." "But with this storm," another man argued, "we're risking the herd's survival. That's nearly a quarter of our breeding stock." The debate continued as they ate the hot stew Hank and Mrs. Turner prepared. Rebecca listened carefully, noting the complexity of the situation, the practical threat to the cattle, the principle at stake, the dangerous weather conditions, the potential for violent confrontation. When there was a momentary lull in the discussion, she spoke up. "What if there were witnesses? People Hargrove couldn't intimidate or dismiss." All eyes turned to her, the men clearly surprised by her intervention. "What do you mean, Miss Morgan?" Noah asked, his tone neutral but attentive. "From what I understand, Hargrove relies on his political connections and the fact that disputes between ranchers are often without neutral observers. But what if the schoolteacher and a respected community elder," she nodded toward Mrs. Turner, "were to accompany you? Not to confront anyone, but simply to document what we see? To be witnesses who could testify if needed?" The room fell silent as they considered her suggestion. One of the ranch hands nodded slowly. "Hargrove's careful about his public image. Having ladies present would force his men to behave more civilized-like." "It's too dangerous," Noah countered, looking directly at Rebecca. "The weather alone makes this risky, not to mention the potential for confrontation." "Those are your concerns for us," Rebecca replied steadily. "But consider our concerns for you riding back into a dangerous situation, outnumbered, in a worsening blizzard. At least with more observers, there's a better chance of resolving this without violence." Mrs. Turner added her support. "She's right, Noah. Sometimes the mere presence of unexpected witnesses changes the dynamics of a confrontation. I've seen it work in town disputes many times." The debate continued, but Rebecca could see that her suggestion had shifted the conversation from confrontation versus capitulation to a potential third path. Eventually, a plan emerged. Noah and his men would return to the disputed pasture, accompanied by Rebecca and Mrs. Turner in a covered sled. They would not engage directly, but would remain visible, creating a social pressure that might force a more reasonable resolution. As the others prepared, Noah drew Rebecca aside, his expression troubled. "I don't like involving you in this. It's not your fight. A community is only as strong as its willingness to stand together in difficult times," she responded. "You've supported the school, helped families through hard winters, created opportunities for local young people like Will Jenkins. Now it's our turn to support you." He studied her face for a long moment, his blue eyes searching hers. "You're not what I expected when you first arrived on that bus," he said finally. "You seemed so fragile then, so wounded by whatever had happened to you in Boston." "I was," she acknowledged simply. "But fragility and strength aren't opposites, they're companions. Sometimes the places where we've been broken become the sources of our greatest resilience." Something in Noah's expression shifted at her words, softening, a recognition that seemed to touch him deeply. Before he could respond, however, Hank called that the sleds were ready. The journey to the south pasture was arduous, the snow now falling so heavily that visibility was reduced to mere yards. Will Jenkins led the way, demonstrating an almost uncanny ability to navigate in conditions that seemed impossible to Rebecca. The covered sled provided some protection from the elements, but the cold was still penetrating, a living presence that sought every gap in clothing and shelter. As they approached the boundary between the two ranches, the situation became visible through occasional breaks in the snowfall. A makeshift fence had been erected around a group of cattle huddled together against the storm, their forms nearly obscured by the accumulating snow. Several men on horseback patrolled the perimeter, while others gathered around a small fire, the only point of warmth in the bleak landscape. Noah's plan was direct, but non-confrontational. He positioned his men at a visible distance, then approached the enclosure alone, raising his hands to show he came to talk, not fight. Rebecca and Mrs. Turner remained in the sled, positioned where they could be clearly seen by Hargrove's men. The negotiations, conducted through the swirling snow, were tense but restrained. The presence of the women clearly created an unexpected complication for Hargrove's foreman, a hard-faced man named Decker, who kept glancing uncomfortably in their direction. "Those cattle won't survive the night in these conditions." Noah's voice carried over the wind. "Whatever dispute we have, surely we can agree that letting animals die needlessly is no one's interest. Should have thought of that before you let them wander onto Blackwater land," Decker retorted, though with less conviction than his words suggested. "We both know that fence was cut deliberately," Noah responded evenly. "But I'm not here to argue about how they got here. I'm offering a reasonable solution. Let us move the cattle to proper shelter now, and we'll address any legitimate concerns through legal channels when the storm passes." The standoff continued, with Decker clearly stalling for time or instructions. The situation might have remained deadlocked if not for an unexpected development. One of the cattle broke through the makeshift fence and stumbled into the open, followed by several others. The animals, desperate for shelter, began moving instinctively toward a grove of trees that offered some protection from the wind. Decker's men moved to intercept them, but the action precipitated a larger breach in the enclosure. Soon, the entire herd was moving, driven by survival instinct toward whatever shelter they could find. The chaos that followed could have escalated into violence, with both groups of men struggling to control panicking cattle in blinding snow. Instead, practicality prevailed. Noah called out clear instructions, directing his men to work with Hargrove's hands to guide the animals toward a nearby ravine that offered natural protection from the storm. Surprisingly, Decker didn't countermand these orders, perhaps recognizing that dead cattle served no one's interests, or perhaps uncomfortable with the prospect of women witnessing needless animal suffering. He grudgingly allowed the collaborative effort to proceed. Rebecca watched from the sled, impressed by Noah's leadership in crisis. Despite his exhaustion, he worked alongside both groups of men, his focus entirely on saving the animals rather than assigning blame. His calm authority seemed to affect everyone present, creating a temporary alliance against their common enemies of cold and storm. By nightfall, the cattle had been secured in the relative shelter of the ravine. Temporary windbreaks were constructed from available materials, and feed was distributed from supplies both ranches contributed. An uneasy truce emerged. The dispute remained unresolved, but the immediate threat to the animals had been addressed. As they prepared to leave, Decker approached Noah with a grudging offer. We'll maintain the herd together until the storm passes. After that, we can sort out ownership and compensation." Noah nodded, too exhausted for further negotiation. "Fair. Enough. I'll send men to relieve yours at dawn." The return journey to the Richardson Ranch was slow and eerily quiet, the storm having reached its peak intensity. Within the sled, Rebecca found herself seated beside Noah, who had finally relinquished the reins to a younger hand with fresh strength. His presence beside her was solid and reassuring despite his obvious fatigue. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind's howl. "Your presence made a difference today." "I did very little," she demurred. The crisis resolved itself when the cattle broke free. Noah shook his head slightly. "It wasn't just about today. It was about knowing I wasn't facing this alone, that someone cared enough to brave a blizzard to stand beside me." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Since Clara died, I've carried everything by myself. Had to be strong. For Matthew, for the ranch, for the men who depend on me for their livelihood. Never allowed myself to need anyone." The confession, offered in the intimate darkness of the storm-surrounded sled, touched Rebecca deeply. This proud, capable man was acknowledging vulnerability, not as weakness, but as a truth about the human condition. "Needing others doesn't diminish your strength," she said softly. "It affirms your humanity." His hand found hers in the darkness, work-roughened fingers closing gently around her smaller ones. The simple contact conveyed more than words could express gratitude. Connection, the tentative beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. They reached the ranch house well after midnight, the storm still raging but the immediate crisis resolved. Too exhausted for conversation, they separated to find whatever rest was possible before dawn would bring new challenges. Rebecca lay awake in the small guest room, listening to the howling wind and reflecting on the day's events. She had come west seeking escape from rejection, convinced that her scarred face had permanently excluded her from meaningful connection. Yet here, in this remote corner of Wyoming, she had found purpose in her teaching and, unexpectedly, a community that valued her contributions above her appearance. And Noah Richardson, the man who had first looked at her without flinching, who had seen her capabilities rather than her limitations, who had just shared with her a vulnerability he showed to no one else, was becoming something she had never dared hope for again. Not a savior or solution to her problems, but a partner in facing life's challenges, someone who understood that strength and fragility could exist in the same heart. The storm raged through the night and into the following day, trapping everyone. At the ranch house, in a peaceful interlude of forced inactivity, Rebecca discovered new dimensions to Noah's world, his extensive library filled with history, poetry, and practical guides to ranching. The maps he had created of his land, marking water sources and optimal grazing areas. Matthew's room with its collections of interesting rocks, feathers, and carefully preserved leaves. "You've made a real home here," she observed as they sat by the fire that evening, the wind finally beginning to diminish outside. Mrs. Turner was playing chess with Hank in the kitchen, while the ranch hands entertained themselves with cards. In the bunkhouse. "Tried to," Noah acknowledged, looking around the comfortable room. "Clara started it. After she died, I almost let it go. Seemed pointless to maintain more than basic necessities. But then I realized Matthew needed more than just survival. He needed beauty, knowledge, connection to something larger than our immediate concerns. That's what education provides at its best," Rebecca said. "Not just practical skills. Windows into wider worlds." Noah nodded, his expression thoughtful as he gazed into the fire. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about fragility and strength being companions, not opposites. It's taken me 5 years to understand that allowing myself to feel Clara's loss doesn't dishonor her memory or make me less capable of caring for our son. Grief is the price we pay for love," Rebecca said softly, remembering words from her own experience of loss. Avoiding one means sacrificing the other. Is that what happened to you in Boston? Noah asked, his tone gentle but direct. You lost someone you loved? The question touched on wounds that had begun to heal but remained tender. Yet in this quiet moment, with the storm creating a cocoon of isolation around them, Rebecca found herself willing to share the truth. Not through death, she said slowly. My fiancé, James, abandoned me after the accident that caused my scar. He couldn't bear the thought of being married to someone who would always draw stares, whispers, pity. Said he needed time to think. But I never saw him again. Noah's expression darkened with a flash of anger quickly controlled. He was a fool. He was conventional, Rebecca corrected, surprising herself with the lack of bitterness in her assessment. His world, our world in Boston, placed enormous value on appearances, on conforming to expectations. The accident didn't just change my face. It changed how society viewed me. James lacked the courage to challenge those views. And you? She considered the question thoughtfully. I ran away. Coming west as a mail-order bride was my attempt to escape a world that had reduced me to my scar. I was looking for someone who would accept me despite my appearance. I never considered that I might find people who would value me because of who the accident helped me become. Noah reached across the space between them, his fingers brushing the scarred side of her face with infinite gentleness. Unlike everyone else who had ever touched her there, his contact didn't hold a trace of pity or revulsion, only wonder, as if the marked skin was precious rather than damaged. This scar is part of your story, he said quietly. But it's not your whole story. It's not even the most interesting chapter. The simple truth of his words washed over her like healing rain. For 2 years, she had defined herself by her disfigurement, allowing it to become the central fact of her existence. Now sitting in this warm room with a man who saw beyond it to the person she truly was, Rebecca felt the last defensive walls around her heart beginning to crumble. I told myself I would never risk loving anyone again, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. That I couldn't survive another rejection. Noah's hand moved from her cheek to capture her fingers, his grip warm and steady. Some risks are worth taking, he said simply. Some connections are worth whatever price they might demand. In his blue eyes, Rebecca saw not blind devotion or desperate need, but something far more valuable, clear-sighted appreciation of who she was, scars and all, combined with the courage to offer his own vulnerable heart in return. As the fire crackled and the storm gradually relinquished its fury outside, they sat together in companionable silence, their hands still joined. No declarations were made, no promises exchanged, yet both recognized that something fundamental had shifted between them, a mutual acknowledgement that healing was possible, that past wounds need not determine future possibilities, that love might be worth believing in after all. Spring arrived in Wyoming with the abrupt transformation that characterized the high plains, a sudden warming of the air, explosive blooming of wildflowers across the prairie, and the emergence of new life everywhere. The harsh winter that had tested the community's resilience melted away, leaving behind strengthened bonds and unexpected alliances. For Rebecca, the changing season brought a profound sense of renewal, both within the schoolhouse and in her own heart. The children returned to their studies with fresh energy, eager to apply their learning to the practical challenges of spring planting and animal husbandry. Under Rebecca and Mrs. Turner's guidance, the curriculum expanded to embrace these seasonal activities, mathematics applied to calculating seed quantities, science lessons focused on germination and growth, reading assignments that connected to the agricultural cycles surrounding them. "You've transformed this place," Mrs. Turner remarked one afternoon as they watched the children working in the small garden they had established behind the schoolhouse. "When you arrived, we were just maintaining basic education. Now we're creating future leaders for this community." Rebecca smiled, observing Thomas Wilson patiently explaining soil preparation to younger students. "They're transforming themselves, We're just providing the opportunities." The older woman's shrewd eyes studied Rebecca's face. "Not just the school that's been transformed, I'd say." Rebecca felt a flush rise to her cheeks, but didn't deny the observation. The months since the winter crisis had indeed brought remarkable changes to her life, both professional and personal. Her relationship with Noah Richardson had evolved with the deliberate pace of something built to endure weekly visits to the schoolhouse, expanding to shared Sunday dinners, careful conversations growing into deeper exchanges, tentative touches becoming more confident expressions of affection. For a woman who had once believed her capacity for love had died alongside her former beauty, this gradual reawakening was both exhilarating and frightening. Noah never pressed for declarations or commitments, seeming to understand intuitively that her heart, like a winter-dormant seed, needed gentle nurturing rather than forced growth. Perhaps the most significant transformation had occurred in Rebecca's relationship with her own appearance. The daily interactions with children who had long since stopped noticing her scar, combined with Noah's matter-of-fact acceptance, gradually shifted how she saw herself. The mirror in her bedroom no longer reflected a woman defined by disfigurement, but rather showed someone whose character had been deepened by adversity, whose smile had returned with genuine warmth, whose eyes held purpose and hope rather than shame and fear. This inner renewal manifested in subtle external changes. She no longer arranged her hair to hide her face. She held her head higher when meeting strangers. She even laughed freely without the instinctive hand that had once risen to cover her scarred cheek. These were small victories, but they represented a profound healing that no surgery could have accomplished. One particularly beautiful May afternoon, as the school day ended and children scattered to their homes, Rebecca found Noah waiting beside his horse at the hitching post. This wasn't unusual. He often timed his visits to coincide with the end of lessons, but something in his expression suggested this was more than a casual social call. "Do you have time for a ride?" he asked, after greeting her. "There's something I'd like to show you." Intrigued, Rebecca quickly changed from her teaching clothes into a riding skirt and joined him. Mrs. Turner waved them off with a knowing smile that Rebecca pretended not to notice. They rode north from the schoolhouse, following a trail that wound through meadows now carpeted with blue lupine and golden balsam root. After nearly an hour, they crested a rise that revealed a breathtaking vista, a verdant valley nestled between protective hills, a clear stream winding through its center, stands of cottonwood trees offering dappled shade along the water's edge. "It's beautiful," Rebecca said, drawing her horse to a halt beside Noah's. "I had no idea this was here." "Few people do," he replied, dismounting and helping her down from her horse. "It's part of the original Richardson land grant, but it's separated from the main ranch by those hills." He gestured toward the western boundary of the valley. "I haven't done much with it yet, just enough grazing to maintain my claim." They walked toward the stream, the horses following behind them to drink from the clear water. The valley felt like a secret world, protected and untouched despite being less than 10 miles from the schoolhouse. "Why show me this now?" Rebecca asked, curious about the timing of this revelation. Noah seemed uncharacteristically hesitant, running a hand through his sun-lightened hair. "I've been thinking about the future. Matthew's growing up fast. The ranch is finally prospering after some difficult years. And—" he paused, turning to face her directly. "And I've realized that success means very little if it isn't shared with people you care about." The implication of his words sent a flutter through Rebecca's chest, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue at his own pace. "When Clara died, I thought that part of my life was over," he said quietly. "I focused on Matthew, on the ranch, on survival. Convinced myself that was enough. But this past year, watching you with the children, seeing how you've overcome your own losses without becoming bitter or closed off, it's awakened something I thought was gone forever. Noah took both her hands in his blue eyes holding hers with unwavering sincerity. Rebecca Morgan, I'm not offering you a perfect life or an unblemished heart. I'm offering you partnership, respect, and a love that truly sees you, exactly as you are. Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes, not from sorrow but from the overwhelming recognition of how far she had traveled from that broken woman who had stepped off the bus in Willow Creek less than a year ago. I came west believing that no one could ever love me again, she whispered. That this scar had marked me as unworthy, unlovable. I was looking for someone who would tolerate my appearance out of necessity or convenience. I never imagined finding someone who would see beyond it to who I truly am. Your scar is just the visible evidence of your courage, Noah said simply. It's your heart that I've fallen in love with, your generosity with the children, your determination to rebuild your life, your willingness to stand beside me during the worst blizzard in 20 years. A smile touched his lips at the memory. Though I'll admit, I was terrified for your safety that day. Rebecca laughed softly, remembering her own determination during that crisis. I was too afraid for you to be scared for myself. Noah's expression grew serious again. That's what love is, isn't it? Caring more about someone else's well-being than your own fears. He gestured to the valley surrounding them. I brought you here because I wanted you to see what I see: possibility. Not just land or property, but a future we could build together, if you want that too. The question hung between them, honest and unhurried. Noah was offering his heart without demands or conditions, giving her the freedom to choose rather than presenting her with a fait accompli. Rebecca looked around the beautiful valley, then back at the man before her, a man who had never flinched from her scars, who had valued her strength even when she couldn't see it herself, who had waited patiently while she rediscovered her capacity for love. The answer rose from her heart with absolute clarity. Yes, she said simply. I want that more than anything. The joy that transformed Noah's face was answer enough, but he drew her into his arms with gentle certainty, his kiss a promise more binding than any formal contract. As they stood together in the spring sunshine, surrounded by wildflowers and possibilities, Rebecca felt the final fragments of her past fears dissolve like morning mist beneath the sun's warmth. Their wedding took place on a perfect June afternoon, with the entire community gathering to celebrate. The schoolhouse had been transformed for the occasion, wildflowers adorning every surface, benches arranged in rows for the guests, a simple arch constructed by Noah's ranch hands framing the front of the room. Mrs. Turner had insisted on handling the preparations, enlisting every willing hand in Willow Creek to create a celebration worthy of the teacher who had revitalized their school and the rancher who had supported their community through difficult times. Never seen anything like it, Frank Holloway remarked to his wife as they watched the final decorations being arranged. Half the county's here, including folks who normally wouldn't speak to each other. Indeed, the gathering transcended the usual divisions of ranch loyalties and economic circumstances. Even Curtis Hargrove, Noah's longtime adversary, had arrived with a grudging gift and civil congratulations, the winter crisis having established a wary respect between the neighboring ranchers. Rebecca prepared for the ceremony in Mrs. Turner's bedroom, assisted by several local women who had become friends over the months. The dress was simple but elegant cream-colored silk ordered specially from Denver, with a design that emphasized her natural grace rather than attempting to distract from her scar. You look beautiful, dear, Mrs. Holloway said, adjusting the small circlet of wildflowers that served as Rebecca's only adornment, absolutely radiant. Rebecca studied her reflection in the mirror, seeing herself through new eyes. The scar remained, of course, permanent reminder of how quickly life could change, but it no longer dominated her self-perception. Instead, she saw a woman transformed by love and purpose, her eyes bright with happiness, her smile genuine and unguarded. I never thought I'd feel this way again, she admitted. After the accident, I believed that part of my life was over that. No one could ever look at me and see anything but damage. Mrs. Turner, practical as always, adjusted a fold in Rebecca's dress. Most people see what they expect to see. Noah Richardson always had the gift of looking deeper. And you, my dear, finally learned to do the same, to see yourself as something more than your scars. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity. Matthew, solemn and proud in his best clothes, stood beside his father as Noah's best man. The boy had blossomed under Rebecca's care, his initial shyness giving way to quiet confidence. His relationship with his future stepmother, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. As Rebecca walked down the aisle on Frank Holloway's arm, he had insisted on the honor in the absence of her own father. She felt none of the nervous uncertainty that had characterized her first engagement years ago. This marriage wasn't based on societal expectations or superficial attraction, but on a deep understanding of each other's strengths and vulnerabilities, forged through shared challenges and honest communication. Noah waited for her beneath the flower-decorated arch, his expression a mixture of reverence and joy that made her heart swell. When she reached him and placed her hand in his, the connection between them was palpable. Two people who had experienced profound loss finding unexpected healing in each other. The local judge performed the ceremony with dignified simplicity, but it was the personal vows that moved the gathering to tears. "Rebecca," Noah began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "I promise to build a life with you based on honesty, respect, and unwavering support. I promise to see you always as you truly are, not defined by your past or limited by others' perceptions, but recognized for your courage, your compassion, and your remarkable spirit. I promise to walk beside you through whatever challenges we face, drawing strength from your resilience and offering mine in return." When it was Rebecca's turn, she spoke from a heart overflowing with gratitude and love. "Noah, I came west believing that happiness was no longer possible for someone like me. You showed me that true connection isn't built on perfection, but on acceptance of ourselves and each other. I promise to be your partner in all things, to nurture the family we're creating with Matthew, to face each day with the courage you helped me rediscover, and to never forget that love sees beyond surface scars to the heart beneath." There wasn't a dry eye in the schoolhouse when they were pronounced husband and wife. The celebration that followed extended well into the evening, with tables set up outside under the cottonwood trees, music provided by local fiddle players, and enough food to feed half the territory. Rebecca found herself constantly surrounded by well-wishers, children from the school presenting handmade gifts, parents expressing gratitude for her teaching, neighbors offering practical advice for married life on a ranch. Through it all, Noah remained close, his steady presence a reminder that she was no longer facing life's challenges alone. As twilight softened the landscape, they slipped away from the celebration to share a quiet moment on the schoolhouse porch. The sounds of music and laughter created a gentle backdrop as they stood together, Noah's arm around Rebecca's waist, watching the first stars appear in the deepening blue sky. "Happy?" he asked simply, looking down at her with eyes that still held wonder at the journey that had brought them together. "More than I ever believed possible," she answered truthfully. "A year ago, I was convinced that love wasn't possible for someone with my scars. Now I understand that the deepest connections come not despite our wounds, but because of how they've shaped us." "We both did," Rebecca said gently, taking her mother's hand. "It took coming here, meeting people who had no preconceptions about who I was or should be, to help me see myself differently. And it took meeting Noah, someone who looked at my scars and saw strength rather than damage, to help me believe in possibilities again." As if summoned by her words, Noah emerged from the barn, Matthew beside him, both dusty from the day's work, but smiling at the sight of the women on the well porch. Eleanor watched her daughter's face transform with love as she greeted her husband and stepson, and something in the older woman's expression softened with understanding. He sees you, she said quietly. The real you, beyond appearances or circumstances. That's rare in any world, East or West. Yes, Rebecca agreed simply, and he helped me learn to see myself that way too. That's even rarer. The 2 weeks of Eleanor's visit became a time of healing and reconnection, not just between mother and daughter, but between past and present. Eleanor immersed herself in ranch life with surprising enthusiasm, helping in the schoolhouse, learning to make bread in a wood stove, even riding a gentle mare on excursions to nearby beauty spots. The Boston society matron gradually revealed a more adventurous spirit than Rebecca had ever suspected, suggesting that perhaps daughter had inherited more from mother than either had realized. On Eleanor's final evening in Wyoming, as they shared a special dinner Noah had insisted on preparing himself, she made an announcement that surprised them all. "I've decided to sell the Boston house," she said calmly, as if discussing the weather rather than a major life change. "It's too large for one person, and it holds too many memories of a life that no longer exists. I'm considering a small cottage in Colorado Springs, where I might be close enough to visit my remarkable grandsons more frequently." She smiled at Matthew, who had quickly claimed her as an honorary grandmother. "Colorado Springs?" Rebecca echoed, stunned by this unexpected development. "But your entire life is in Boston, your friends, your charitable committees, your church." Eleanor set down her fork with deliberate precision. "My life was in Boston," she corrected gently. "But watching you these past weeks has taught me something important. That new beginnings are possible at any age. That courage isn't limited to the young, and that family connections matter more than social ones." The decision was emblematic of the ripple effects that had spread from Rebecca's own journey. Her transformation from a woman defined by her scars to one characterized by her strength and purpose had inspired others to reconsider their own limitations and possibilities. Eleanor was just the most recent example of how one person's courageous choice could illuminate pathways for others. As they stood at the stage depot the following morning, Rebecca embraced her mother with genuine regret at their parting. "Write to me when you've settled in Colorado Springs," she urged. "And know that you're welcome here any time for visits or for longer, if you decide that cottage isn't quite what you expected." Eleanor's eyes were bright with unshed tears as she boarded the stage. "I'm so proud of you," she said simply. "Not despite what happened, but because of who you've become through it all." The stage disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving Rebecca and Noah standing together in the autumn sunshine. He slipped an arm around her waist, solid and supportive as always. "Your mother's right, you know," he said quietly. "What you've accomplished here, not just surviving but thriving, not just adapting but transforming both yourself and this community, it's remarkable." Rebecca leaned into his embrace, grateful beyond words for this man who had helped her rediscover her capacity for love, for this place that had offered her not pity but purpose, for this life that had emerged from the ashes of her former expectations. "We've accomplished it together," she corrected gently. "You, me, Matthew, this community, we've all grown through supporting each other." As they walked back toward their waiting horses, Rebecca glanced at her reflection in the stage depot window. The scarred woman looking back at her was not the same person who had arrived in Willow Creek a year earlier, not because her appearance had changed, but because her perception of it had transformed completely. The scar remained, a permanent reminder of how quickly life could change. But now it represented not loss but resilience, not shame but strength, not an ending but the beginning of a journey she could never have imagined when she first stepped off that westbound stage. The woman who had once believed love was impossible for someone with her scars had discovered a profound truth, that the deepest love comes not from physical perfection, but from mutual recognition of each other's authentic selves, scars, struggles, strengths, and all. In finding a gentle cowboy who saw beyond her surface wounds to the courage beneath, Rebecca had not only restored her faith in love, but discovered a capacity for joy and purpose, greater than anything she had known before. As they rode home together beneath the vast Wyoming sky, the future stretched before them like the open prairie, not without challenges, certainly, but rich with possibilities for those brave enough to embrace them with open hearts and clear eyes. And Rebecca Morgan Richardson, once defined by her scars, but now characterized by her strength, rode toward that future with the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.